All right.
Ladies and yes, no, we're going to stand for the anthem. So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We invite you to stand for the national anthem of Barbados. Thank you. You may be seated. Good evening. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank Group President, Mr. Luis Alberto Moreno, I wish to extend a warm welcome to the 9th consultation of the Governors of the Caribbean Country Department and the Caribbean Development Bank. My name is Yahaira Archibald from Country Office Barbados. The IDB Group wishes to specially welcome and acknowledge the following governors and heads of delegations: the Honorable Mia Amor Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados and Minister of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment; the Honorable Peter Turnquest, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in the Bahamas; the Honorable Winston da Costa Jordan, Minister of Finance for Guyana; the Honorable Sherry-Ann Critchlow Coburn, Minister of Planning and Development in Trinidad and Tobago; Dr. Wayne Henry, Director General of the Planning Institute of Jamaica; and Ms. Iris Sandel, Head of the Suriname Delegation. Governors, welcome. The IDB Group also wishes to acknowledge members of the Cabinet and Parliament of Barbados, members of the delegations of the IDB Caribbean member countries, Dr. Warren Smith, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, the IDB's Executive Vice President, Vice Presidents, and Secretary of the Bank, Therese Turner-Jones, General Manager of the IDB Caribbean Country Department, as well as other IDB Group General Managers and Sector Managers. We also acknowledge the presence of our distinguished panelists and presenters, members of staff of the IDB Group, specially invited guests, and members of the media. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening again, and welcome to you all. Every year, the IDB organizes this consultative meeting with governors of its Caribbean member countries in preparation for its annual meeting of the Board of Governors. Now, as we set the context for this year's consultation, which has as its theme Inclusive Caribbean, it is my privilege to welcome to the podium a visionary who has spearheaded a profound transformation of the IDB Group so that it continues to be responsive and relevant to the region's needs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium President Luis Alberto Moreno.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to especially thank Prime Minister Mia Motley, a good friend and a true leader of the Caribbean, I equally want to thank all the ministers who are with us today, who happen to be our governors, who make a big effort to be here, and of course, to all the executive directors and my colleagues from the IDB. Prime Minister has set a big challenge to get growth going, and so we brought a very big constituency from the bank, hoping to spend more in Barbados and help a little bit the economy. But it's really an honor to be here, Prime Minister, and thank you all for coming. Barbados is a great place going, as we all know, through an immense transformation. But, you know, I like to imagine, what if Bill Gates had been born in Barbados? Would he have created Microsoft or become the richest man? Or what about Steve Jobs? Would he be using iPhones if he had grown up a few streets from here? Of course, everybody here has heard of Microsoft and or Apple. But let me ask you, have you heard of Archie? And I'm not talking about the hamburgers. If you're not one of those who knows or were the first users of the internet, the answer is probably you have not heard about it. But like Microsoft and Apple, Archie was a great invention. Even today, experts consider in the world that this was the first world's internet search engine. And its creator, Alan Entabli, was born right here in Barbados. After graduating After graduating at the top of his class, Alan studied computer science in Canada, where he created Archie. Soon after that, half of Canada's internet traffic was going through Archie. And Alan never patented his invention, but his technology led to the creation of search engines such as Google, which is now worth, as we all know, more than the combined GDP of all the Caribbean countries. Now, I share Alan's story because I want us to think about how many others like him there are who are growing up right here in the Caribbean, right here in Barbados. And the question, of course, is, are we doing everything we can to give these future inventors the opportunities they need to reach their God-given potential? These are exactly the kind of people that need to solve our biggest problems. And as we begin our conversation today, I want to urge you to consider the need that we have to harness the untapped potential of all the citizens of the Caribbean. And certainly, despite obvious challenges, including climate change and related natural disasters, this is a particularly promising time for this region. At a time when civic tensions are running high in most countries in South America and around the world, the Caribbean offers an oasis of stability. Here, democracies are stable, elections are regular, free and fair, and as it happens in Barbados, sometimes the winner takes all. But here, economies are also resilient, and they're growing. And here also judiciaries are independent, and the rule of law works. So it is within that context that I want to discuss some of the urgent challenges that we face and the potential that we have for meeting them. As you know, climate change is turning catastrophic weather events into the new normal. Sea levels are rising, storms are becoming stronger and more frequent, and the Caribbean is more exposed to them than in any other region. Hurricane Dorian, as we recall, claimed 69 lives in the Bahamas, and it caused damages that exceed $3.4 billion. Then there is crime. On average, 40% of the region's population sees crime as an ever greater problem than climate change. Last year alone, more than 1,500 people were murdered in Caribbean countries. That's 1,500 people whose potential has been lost forever. The global economy also is facing challenges. Trade tensions make it even harder for Caribbean economies to improve their already limited integration into global supply chains. And meanwhile, technological change implies that local workers must adapt continuously to compete in the global economy, in many cases without the resources they need to do so. Now, to ignite economic growth in this context, Caribbean countries need to revamp their economies to ensure that they are on the cutting edge in both public and private sector productivity. We also need to better exploit domestic and regional markets, increasing integration within the region, and none of this, as we know, is easy. But we cannot afford to put off dealing with these challenges. Think about, again, the next computer scientist from this region. Are we educating him or her in a way that increases her potential? Are we making it easy for her to get from home to school safely? Are we protecting her from gender-based discrimination and violence? When she comes of age, it will be easy for her to open a business and protect her intellectual property. Are we doing all that we can to ensure that a hurricane doesn't destroy everything she worked hard to build? In our conversations today, I would like for us to really get to the heart of what it will take to move the Caribbean to the next level of development. What will it take for us to build more resilient countries with connected smart cities? When will citizens have digital identities that give them easy access to state services? And when will we help spark another innovation like that of Archie and benefit from its true worth? And as I noted before, one of the region's greatest challenges is its long history of democratic institutions. People in the Caribbean participate actively in the political system. Perhaps that is one of the reasons the Caribbean has been free from the protests that other parts of the world have experienced recently. Democratic dialogue is vital to building consensus for difficult economic and social policy reforms. And this is not to say that local economies are as democratic or as inclusive as local political systems. Many Caribbean citizens lack the skills to contribute productively to the economy, and many small-scale entrepreneurs lack the credit needed to expand their businesses. Bureaucratic red tape still holds back new business creation, while connected elites can always find a way around these barriers. It is time, therefore, to diversify our economies and expand beyond growth that is led by natural resources while still continuing to invest in tourism. Tomorrow, we will begin the day with a global perspective on inequality and inclusive growth, as well as an overview of the experience in both Latin America and the Caribbean. Later, we will delve into key sectoral issues, such as education and financial inclusion, and discuss how to create more economic opportunities for Caribbean cities and citizens. Finally, we will debate how to get the most out of existing economic strengths to make the Caribbean economies more dynamic and more sustainable. Now, over the past 15 years at the IDB, I've had the opportunity to witness your extraordinary resilience in person. I've had also seen your incredible potential firsthand. My hope is that you see that potential and seize it. Caribbeans like Alan Emtage have been innovating for generations, even if they haven't always reaped the full rewards of their work. The Jamaican economist and cultural icon Rex Nettleford once said that if Caribbeans can own nothing else, they can own their creative imagination, which is a powerful means of production that brings meaning and purpose to human life. I couldn't agree more with that. And before closing, let me just say that I want to congratulate Caribbean constituency for having your executive director now be part of the Secretary General's Task Force on Climate Change. Selwyn has been a fantastic He's been a fantastic partner, a great advocate for the Caribbean countries, and always reminding us how important it is for a bank the size of the IDB to never lose sight of this very great region. And I want to thank you for that, Selwyn. You will be missed by certainly me and many of our colleagues, but we know we have you in the right place at the right time to remind the Secretary General and that small bureaucracy at the UN of how important the IDB is for this region. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, President Moreno. It is now my honor to welcome to the podium to offer remarks the IDB's Governor for Barbados. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mia Amor-Motley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, President Moreno, my colleague governors of the Inter-American Development Bank, members of the Cabinet of Barbados, members of the executive of the Inter-American Development Bank, members of the Public Service of Barbados, distinguished Barbadians all. Some of you may not have known Alan Emtage, but we know of his work. And I thank the President for reminding us. But I want to also ask you to remember this name for the future. And his name is Christian Payne. And Christian Payne has developed something called LARA. And anything named LARA in the Caribbean needs to be able to perform at optimal levels. But he's a young Barbadian, and he too, like many others, deserves the chance to be able to have LARA, which is a form of machine learning. You give it a set of instructions and information, and it learns by itself to become better. And I had the good fortune of meeting this young man a few weeks ago. He is now working with us in the archives, and I've asked the Attorney General to allow him to also work with the Royal Barbados Police Force, because we are equally conscious that if we, as members of the public sector, do not create the opportunities that we can for our young, talented people, then they are likely to be able to fall off of the precipice of opportunity. And it was as if, Luis Alberto, that you heard me last night. Last night we were in Speightstown in an ideas forum. And another young man got up to remind us that the persons who really dealt with Ring came out of Barbados. And I said then, when challenged on access to telecommunications, that I don't know who is the next Bill Gates or who is the next Jeff Bezos. But what I do know is that this country has produced world-class people, and that it is our duty to ensure that there is access always and inclusion always to the kind of environment that will allow for greater digital literacy, because we simply do not know where they're coming from. And I say so all the more confident that the example of Sir Garfield Sobers, the greatest of all time, as a young boy in the Bayland outside of Bridgetown, and of Rihanna, the greatest, I believe she will be of her kind and her time too, as a young girl on the other side of town in Westbury Road, reflect the experiences of two people who were not necessarily born into wealth, whose genius were both allowed to flourish because of the openness of the society and the encouragement of the society. And I take your point completely, because in a very real sense, we have to guard against anything at all that will hamper the chances of ordinary citizens from being the best that they can be. It is against this background that, as Caribbean countries, we continue to be committed to making it and making life better for our people. One of the reasons why we have the levels of stability traditionally that we do has been largely because of our commitment to education and our commitment to public health and affordable access to health care. To a lesser extent, we have tried with housing, and we've not been as comprehensive in our success there, but we have created the opportunities to allow our citizens to be able to move to the next level. This country, Barbados, joined the Inter-American Development Bank 50 years ago last year. As you celebrated your 60th anniversary, we celebrated our 50th anniversary with the bank. And over the course of those 50 years, we have seen over 174 projects of different types executed with this bank. This is what you call a partner. We have been able, in particular, in the areas of education and in the areas of coastal protection, to see some wonderful work that is second to none. And I reflect on that because you have contextualized what the next 10 or 20 or 30 years is likely to be in terms of ideas. It's not going to be the traditional education, or it's not going to be limited to the coastal protection that we've done in the past. Because the climate crisis reflects different problems. For the Bahamas, the reality of Dorian and what it was doing there, having left Barbados almost untouched because of the Sahara dust sucking out the convection. But the reality of the Bahamas is the one aspect of the climate crisis that most grabs the headlines, the hurricanes. But we all know that there are insidious consequences of the climate crisis that don't get the headlines, but that are as debilitating as the chronic NCDs, which is our second existential threat as a people. I refer to the groundwater crisis, the increasing prevalence of high levels of salinity in wells that otherwise supplied water freely and easily for us. I refer to the sargassum seaweed that is causing horrors across the entire region and as far as Mexico, and does its damage on a daily basis because of the toxicity of the seaweed that literally will prevent persons from wanting to patronize hotels and restaurants and other tourism attractions or normal businesses for citizens that are in coastal communities. These things are having a deleterious impact on the performance of our economy and in the capacity of our economy to be resilient. And these are some of the things that we hope as we go forward that the bank will allow us to be able to drill down, to be able to meet the concerns, recognizing that we, yes, have to meet the heart attack of the hurricanes, but we cannot ignore the reality of those consequences that are making it difficult for our governments to respond to our populations within the region. Similarly, the ability to be able to leverage our creativity to find the solutions with respect to these same problems becomes important. The reality of the Caribbean private sector is that it remains shallow in terms of its capacity to have and access resources. And therefore, our ability to be able to innovate in our financial markets, new instruments that will allow us to be able to better access the $50 billion in domestic savings that exists within the region that are right now attracting less than 1%, in most instances 0.1 and 0.2% in interest rates, becomes a real concern for us because the untapped potential of growth is being strangled by the lack of oxygen of financing. And we believe that the Inter-American Development Bank for the Caribbean constituency has a role that it can play. I say so conscious that we are trying to move forward critical pieces of instruments and agreements, the financial services agreement for the region, the ability to be able to have a unified agreement that allows us to be able to have our stock exchanges function in a far more harmonized environment, the ability to be able to have mutual recognition of companies across our borders. These are all things that are constraining the development of Caribbean enterprises, many of whom remain undercapitalized, but many of whom are still badly in need of access to capital if they are going to move to the next level. And because they're undercapitalized, the traditional banks have viewed them with great suspicion and are not prepared to extend the financial terms that they need to move to the next level. That has been the reality of many a Caribbean hotel. You're undercapitalized for a region that is as highly dependent on tourism as we are. The unwillingness of the traditional banks to lend to tourism establishments is startling. And we have to be able, therefore, to think outside of the box and see how best we can mobilize capital, create the trust that is necessary so that people don't feel afraid of wanting to lend or to put forward or to invest their money and to be able to move to the next level. This is not a national problem. This is a regional issue. And it is one of even greater concern given the contraction of the presence of the international banks that have hitherto occupied a very large space in this region, in many instances for as long as a century. We also need to recognize, as I said in Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad, Port of Spain on Monday morning, that the issue of energy and cooperation in energy needs now to be a regional topic which we pay serious attention. The revised Treaty of Chaguaramas deals with the issue of energy in one sentence: that COTED should use its best efforts to promote energy and sustainable resources of the region. We have passed that point. Trinidad has had a long and distinguished career in the optimization of its fossil fuel resources. But we now have to add to the mix Guyana, whose 8 billion barrels of reserves, Winston, seem almost incomprehensible to mere mortals like us. Suriname, whose finds in the last few weeks cause us to remember that oil moves in a vein, and therefore it is not surprising that Suriname should now be following Guyana with respect to the good news that it is sharing with the rest of the world. Jamaica, with what it is doing on the Pedros Banks, Bahamas, Grenada, and in our own case in Barbados, Minister Abrams would have seen to it that last week we signed the exploration licenses with BHP such that we can move to the next level of our offshore energy resources. It cannot be that we continue to treat to these issues in an isolated fashion. Equally, as I said in Trinidad and Tobago, it cannot be that within the context of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, that we don't recognize that the first obligation that we have towards each other is to treat each other better than we treat to the outside world. And it is against that background that I believe that Trinidad has a role to play in helping us mobilize our resources and to help us structure what are the things that we need to do to be able to ensure that we have our citizens educated to benefit from this bounty, that we have instruments in both support services as well as other services to be able to allow for funding so our own citizens can get a piece of the action as well in issues pertaining to energy conservation and, of course, in issues pertaining to renewable energy. We have already, as heads of government, taken a decision, Mr. President, in the St. Anne's Declaration that the regional private sector must come to the table to be able to help the Caribbean community solve the intractable problems that we have. And in 4 particular areas, we've asked them to concentrate. 1, renewable energy. 2, in helping us to reduce the food import bill of the $5 billion US that we're now spending in food imports at a time when Guyana and Suriname and Belize alone could begin to solve the problem overnight, but we, for good measure, can add all of the rest of us who can add value to that reduction of that import bill. 3, the area of maritime and air transport, because we need the maritime and air bridges to connect our countries if we are going to reduce the debilitating costs that are associated with trading or moving people between the territories. In the same way that if we are running our countries, it is inconceivable that we could have a country without bus service to St. Lucie, St. Andrew, and St. Peter. It should be inconceivable that we can have a Caribbean community that does not allow for easy access to every point in the community. And fourthly, the ICT technologies of which both of us have spoken, that ought to be the technological platform on which we build. I refer to these things because I do believe that the IDB's work, which has traditionally been seen only as support for government, is going to find greater resonance as we move forward in the regional private sector, especially against the background of the contracting presence of the commercial banks in the region. This region cannot sustain the levels of growth without new creative financial instruments. And the nimbleness of the bank in being able to meet this response is what ought to be a consideration for you and for us as governors as we sit down here in the next 2 days. I'd also like to thank the bank for its creativeness with respect to the contingent catastrophe facility, which remains as an option for all of us in the event of the hits. But I want to go further. As I indicated, I believe, when I was in Washington for your diamond anniversary, the natural disaster clauses which the government of Barbados has been able to put in our new financial instruments is a model which I believe ought to be examined by the bank. It makes no sense leaving uncertain what will happen post-hurricane, post-storm, post-catastrophic floods, post-earthquake. For our countries, which are as fragile as they can be to intervening events such as this. And to that extent, what the natural disaster clauses do is to provide certainty as to what will happen if an event of a certain seriousness takes place, such that we can literally defer our interests and capitalize it, and defer the payment of principal for 2 years. In the case of Barbados, to put it in context, and it will increase as our interest costs and our debt comes back outside of the BERT program to more realistic levels. But it will save us, over the course of the 2 years, over $1 billion, which in the context of a serious natural disaster is the kind of fiscal flexibility, the fiscal elbow room that you need. Now, if you don't have certainty on your instruments, or the bank doesn't have certainty in its policy, then everyone is running around wondering, 1, has a default occurred? 2, are we really capable of servicing the debt? 3, do we now have to send persons to negotiate and to do all the kinds of things when those persons ought really to be concerned about stabilization of the consequences of the disaster and rebuilding? I put this on the table in the hope that the bank, in coming to Barbados, will appreciate that our ability to be able to have certainty in facing what is now an annual potential threat with respect to the climate crisis, triggering these kinds of climatic events, requires certainty on the part of the bank, and especially the bank, because it cannot not know what is the reality of its constituent members with respect to what they face on an annual basis. We are 4 months away from the next hurricane season, and we don't know which one of us in here will be facing what the Deputy Prime Minister of the Bahamas and the Minister of Finance has had to face over the course of the last few months. The last point that I'd like to make is a slightly different point. And I know, Mr. President, that you're leaving, but I believe that you still have a significant amount of influence left in you. 40% of this region represents the Afro-American population, Afro-Caribbean population, in Latin America, in Central America, in the Caribbean. And I do believe that we need to be sensitive to the diversity that both within the bank and within the stakeholder relations of the bank that we need to be able to see in order to ensure that there is a general acceptance that we too are fully at the table. And I have known you long enough to know that this is a matter that you can and will treat too with the seriousness with which it deserves. I want at this stage, however, to publicly thank you. This is your third visit to Barbados in less than 2 years. If ever a country needed a friend, it was Barbados on the 25th of May, 2018. I didn't have to ask you. On the first occasion, you called and said, I will be there. In 2018, we then saw over 120 million US, I think it was, disbursed, but of which the 100 million US was primarily in the loan which allowed us to stabilize our macroeconomic condition, which, as you know, and yesterday only in this room, my senior technical advisor, Dr. Greenidge, was able to share with the private sector of Barbados the dire precipice upon which we were located in June 2018, when if we had honored our debt obligations, it would have reduced us literally to less than 150 million US dollars, less than 3 weeks of import cover to be able to stabilize this country. Your statement by coming here, your continued actions that led to the stabilization by the disbursement of the 100 million US to stabilize our macroeconomic condition, along with that of the Caribbean Development Bank, who became also our, I don't know whether to call you brother and sister, brother as president, sister as institution. But between the two of you, you have allowed us to be able to reach the point where today, this morning, the government of Barbados can record that we have 740 million US dollars in reserves and holding 18.7 weeks, up from 4 to 5 weeks where it was when we took over the government. This has not happened by accident. And we accept that when you fall down in a hole, if you have to try and get out of that hole on your own, you might break an arm, or you might break a leg, or worse than that, you might puncture your lungs. If you have a friend to help you out of that hole, as we had in you, as we had in the Caribbean Development Bank, as we had with our friends at your sister organization, the fund, then it becomes easier to lift yourself out of the hole. You still have to do the recovery work. You still have to do the heavy lifting to trigger growth. But what you did was to allow us to be able to see the opportunities, to be able to see the way, as the governor of the central bank has pointed out to the country only recently, that growth is ahead of us in this year of our Lord. This is a country whose economy stagnated for the last decade. We call it the lost decade. And we say it stagnated because while in nominal terms it is the same value as it was in 2007, in real terms there has been a devaluation in the lives and value and pockets of Barbadians, and there has been an implosion of too many institutions that we would wish to recount at this stage. We have turned the corner. And despite the efforts of the media to distort what was said yesterday, the future of this country this year looks good. And it looks good not because we want it to feel good as others have expressed in the media. It looks good because the actual hard work has been done on the projects. The 2 loans which we just signed could not have been signed without the serious work of structuring out what would be done, both as preconditions to those loans, as well as now the execution of them to modernize the Barbados Public Service with $40 million that will allow us to move ministry to ministry to ministry to ministry to not only reconstruct the rules, but to digitize where possible and to make it possible for the average Barbadian company or citizen to access records, access services in a seamless way. The $30 million that we just signed for with the smart energy allows us to be able to leverage renewable energy on many of government's properties. The government of Barbados is spending about $400 million a year in the importation of fuel at a time when the geopolitics of the world threatens to increase that amount because we don't know when, how, or where we might have now to face a scarcity of supply and an increase in prices because of decisions being taken elsewhere that might not always meet and match the application of logic or the application of wisdom as the Bible would tell us to do with our hearts. I therefore want to thank you and to say to you that this economy will continue to grow by the decisions that we take to deconstruct the practices that have hobbled it, the practices that have restricted the conduct of business, but in addition, the building out of the infrastructure as we are doing with the Caribbean Development Bank, with the air runway that is now starting, the relaying of that runway to ensure that we are not compromised in the delivery of our tourism product or in the other projects which we are working on pertaining to the sewage system, which we prefer to talk about as a historic fact than a current reality. I want, therefore, to end by also, like you, and doing it yet again. I did it just now as we signed the loan, but I am so proud to be able to reflect on the fact, and I know that we governors are losing a good man, but I believe that we're gaining a great champion in the fight against the climate crisis. Selwyn Hart has been a distinguished Barbadian in the defense of the interests of the Caribbean community. He has represented us within the halls of this bank with distinction. But when I used the past tense just now, it was only as a prelude to tell you that I anticipate that we have not yet seen the best that he has to offer. And I believe that as he applies himself to a task for which he is well prepared. Many forget that he was the representative, the assistant of Ban Ki-moon, as Ban Ki-moon put together the Green Climate Fund. I have not forgotten it. And therefore he goes to the job of Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action, not just with ability, but with experience. And the combination of ability and experience is a deadly combination if you want to be successful. And I therefore look forward, Selwyn, to great things for you, but even for the rest of us as Caribbean people, that the island states of the Caribbean have now a voice at the table of the global community to defend our interests, to articulate our vulnerabilities, and to require consistently and insistently the kind of assistance and financing that the global community is yet to put up. The Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage remains an elusive topic and cannot be if the global community is serious about righting the wrongs of having us on the front line of the climate crisis, while at the same time not being the ones responsible for the kind of emissions of greenhouse gases that are causing the problems. So we look forward to your work, and we pledge our support in any and every way. I want to thank my colleague governors and to say to you, it is a good thing to see you here. I hope that the hospitality extended to you over yesterday, today, tomorrow will cause you to believe that you really ought to spend the weekend here and not be rushing home. Thank you, and God bless you.
For over 50 years, we've shared a vision for the Caribbean. While you were finding ways to make your region better and stronger, we were doing the same. While we funded public health projects in Trinidad and Tobago, Professor Terence Forrester was researching the economic impact of lifestyle diseases on the region. When we decided half of all loans must benefit low-income people, Rhonda's main goal was establishing over 20 charities across the Caribbean. While we were funding conservation projects in Barbados, entrepreneur James Husbands was installing solar water heaters in Caribbean homes and hotels. When we funded expansion of science programs at the University of the West Indies, Professor Michael Taylor was a student who would go on to be among the world's leading voices on climate change. When we made $100 million available to help the Bahamas recover from Hurricane Dorian, thousands of Bahamians were helping their neighbors to do the same. And our work is just beginning. A renewed vision of an innovative, growing, and sustainable Caribbean inspires us to jump forward. While we fund digital transformation, the region's entrepreneurs have the freedom to put their ideas into action. While we help Caribbean institutions to diagnose debt risk and respond to fiscal challenges, leaders make informed decisions to drive growth. While the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator connects sustainable projects to funding, a new generation of resilient innovators establishes the world's first climate smart zone. While we create new ways to promote equity, Caribbean people of all ages, ethnicities, and genders thrive in societies that are safe, productive, and happy. While we continue to be your trusted partner, you jump forward to the future.
We in the Caribbean punch above our weight, don't we? Yes. I believe that another key takeaway from that video is that the support from the IDB to the Caribbean over the past 5 decades has been meaningful. And that's a characteristic that we certainly want to maintain. So, we had quite a full discussion here already today with the information that we've gotten from our featured guests. And there really isn't much left to say, but I do want to give them the opportunity to frame our discussion for tomorrow. So I would like to invite President Moreno and Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, to have a brief conversation to, as I said, set the tone for tomorrow's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After always hearing Prime Minister Mottley, you always make us think a lot. But And I know clearly that, you raised many of these set of new issues that we're living with today. If I look back 15 years ago when I came out of the bank, the issues of migration, the way we see them today in the region were not there. Certainly, climate change was an issue, but never of the scale and of the implications that we see in a variety of fronts. And no question, the digital revolution, I was saying to my colleagues the other day, I remember people were impressed because I had a BlackBerry at the time, and I could communicate, by sending basic messages. I mean, nobody probably today remembers what a BlackBerry looks like. And then, for the Caribbean specifically, this question of natural disasters is the one that you have been talking a lot about. And it really worries us. And many of the things that you have talked about, we haven't stood still because essentially, as you kind of suggested it in your talk, but in other talks I've heard you, at the end of the day, the only way to deal with this is to grow the level of risk that one can take on and the diversity of that risk such that you include other countries in a more regional way. But one of the things that we learned in the Bahamas, and speaking today with the finance minister of the Bahamas, is very intriguing. We helped them do the damage assessment. And in the damage assessment, what you find is that the majority of the damage was not to public goods as such, but rather to the private sector. And I would like you to dwell on a number of issues. We always talk about, on the one hand, disaster preparedness. What do we need to have in place in case a disaster happens? And I remember about 10 years ago, we created a grant facility to facilitate Caribbean countries to take on resources from that fund such that they could work on disaster preparedness, and very few countries used it. And secondly, something we don't talk enough, but I know you've addressed it a number of times, and as we dwell into this, is the whole question of what do you do with building codes? What do you do with buildings that are built under code? How do you deal with people who cannot do it? I mean, this is the one challenge that is over and above anything that we can do in insurance. So as we look forward, what do you recommend that we should be focusing on? What areas require the Caribbean countries to work more together, and where can we, as a regional public good, develop something that can help very much in this space, especially now that you have the privilege of chairing the CARICOM countries, and where we could perhaps find a possibility to integrate that better?
You raised a lot of things, and we could probably spend all evening talking about it. But a couple of things I'll say to you. One, the IDB has given us a tool, which I should have mentioned just now, called the Encrypt, which allows us to be able to assess the hazards and the vulnerability and the risk. We actually took a presentation of it at Cabinet, and the extent to which we can now be prepared to determine what is the specific vulnerability in a particular district. Is it to floods? Is it to wind? Is it to coastal wave action? Is a tremendous tool. The project actually finishes this month. And so important is it to us that I have committed to ensuring that the project unit remains a permanent unit in the public service of Barbados, because its data is now aged. And the only way this tool is going to make sense is if its data is real time. I believe that that tool should be shared with every single Caribbean country, because at the macro level, it allows us to be able to make better decisions on planning, on where houses should go and how houses should be built, etc. The other thing that we did was that we took a decision to change how we build houses. And the Minister of Housing is here now. He has his ministry has gone out to tender, and they have received a number of house designs. And those house designs are intended to be able for low-income earners in particular, and persons who are not working, to be able to ensure that we can build structures that are far more resilient. And I give this story so often that the Cabinet is probably tired of hearing it. But after Hurricane Janet, the houses that we had, which traditionally had the steep gable roofs or the hip roofs, would generally survive much better. But after Hurricane Janet, the scale of house damage was such that we didn't have enough carpenters to build back, and we got into the habit of building these flat roof houses. My greatest fear for this nation is that if a hurricane or a bad storm hits us, that we will suffer significant loss of housing as a result of roofs that are really not appropriate to meet the elements. And that's why we have conceptualized a concept. Minister Carroll has been working assiduously at it for me to, along with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and other ministries, to do a roofs to reefs project that is intended to be transformational. One of the things, having been this road before in government, I realized, is that you can have many little loans, but what you really need at the end of the day is to borrow for transformational projects. When we borrow for the digitization or the renewable energy, we are transforming forever. And we believe that we need to find a way of helping these same private sector, private individuals who are low income, in some instances no income, be able to help transition them. Because the loss of life comes from what? Comes from poorly constructed houses that can't withstand the elements. Now what happened in Dorian was highly unusual, that the hurricane just dropped, boom,
Stayed there.
and did not move for what, 36 hours on a flat land. And therefore the damage was as catastrophic as it could possibly be. And we saw it when we flew over Abaco 36 hours after the all clear. We feel that there is no sense in individual countries developing project proposals and it being unique to the individual country. We're facing the same challenges. And for us to have to go each time and repeat the process of project preparation is a waste of time, rather than having a clearing house, particularly maybe in the governor's office, in the constituency's office, that will allow us to share and countries then to make decisions. Is this applicable to me? Can I use this roof to reef project in the Bahamas? Can I use the renewable energy project in Guyana? Don't mind, Winston, the $8 billion. You might still want some renewable energy. President Granger has said that he wants us to send our solar water people there and some other people to do renewable energy. So I really feel that we need to share our resources better, and therefore when our house designs are finished, we are prepared equally to share it within the constituency. The other major area that I think that the bank can help in, especially with the diversification of risk, is water. The British government and the Dutch government built water systems for the Caribbean more than 100 years ago in terms of the pipe infrastructure in particular. Many of our pipes are 120 years old, 130 years old. What's the horror story? That our non-revenue water is somewhere between 40 and 55%. How much is yours? You're down to how much now? 20%. You've been working on it. I'm sure Guyana is similar. Trinidad is similar. Jamaica is similar. Suriname is similar. And each of us will face a higher premium if we go to the market alone. But if there's a diversified risk, particularly given the other macroeconomic issues that you will assess in determining whether the loan ought to be made and what is the price of the loan, if you go to the market with a diversified package, the exposure to hurricanes and the disruption of the project, that you will get a better cost of capital probably. You'll get more efficient use of the planning instruments and the execution of the project and a better price on the pipes. Wilfred knows that in our position, we have only replaced less than 2% of the pipes from 100 years ago. Now, we have determined that we need to do it in a more strategic fashion and not simply replace only where pipes burst, and that we need to look at our capital city We need to look at our other towns that are affecting the greatest amount of economic activity. And we need to do it because you can't have a groundwater crisis that, as we're having, a drought, and then afford to waste half of all of the water that you're pumping out of the reservoirs. It is a nonsensical approach. The prices that we've been told are horrific. That it is about $1 million Barbados a kilometer. Now, I don't accept that, but it's going to still be hefty. And we have literally 2,500 kilometers of pipe, having replaced only about 2% of it. Now, that is a generational problem. And it's a generational problem for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, problem for Guyana, for Jamaica. Bahamas, in spite of its bringing down in non-revenue water, still has elements to do. So those are some of the things that I think that, from a regional perspective in the context of the climate crisis and disaster preparedness, stronger houses, stronger codes, more effective instruments in terms of how we raise capital, sharing of our planning documents so that we don't have to do project preparation on our own, and finally, diversifying the risk by pooling on things that are common to us all, like water mains.
Prime Minister, going for a second, I mean, you were, in the many things you've done in your political career, you were Minister of Education. And clearly, you know, for a region like the Caribbean, not unlike many other regions of the world, you have this huge disconnect between skills and the education system. You mentioned earlier, you know, the great windfall that now Guyana is going to have, and hopefully Suriname, where it's going to create a huge pressure on the kinds of skills around services that probably are not today in those countries, but it will equally radiate throughout the whole of the Caribbean. Now, this we know it's going to happen. How can one think of looking forward to make the best out of that opportunity for the region as a whole? Because I really believe that there's a lot of talent here. There's all this digital revolution. You know, it's amazing when you hear the story of Archers that its creator had to go to a university in Canada. But the reality is that today those skills you can develop at home as well. How do you see that evolving, and where do you think we could support you in doing that?
Well, I think that one of the key things is that we have to have the will to cooperate first. We're coming to the game late. And there's no doubt Guyana has already started to pump oil. Suriname has been pumping for many years, but the bounty is ahead of it. And we're coming to the game late, therefore, in terms of the preparation of skills that we could offer them. With the best will in the world, with a population of 780,000, 800,000, Guyana is going to need people to come in to deal with both the oil and the non-oil economy. With the best will in the world, Suriname is larger than the Netherlands, but has a population base of just about 580, 600,000. It cannot. Netherlands has 17 million people. So that we have a serious problem with populations. Even Barbados' case. Barbados compared to Singapore, Singapore is 630 square kilometers. We're 430, Singapore is 670, but Singapore has 5 million people. We have 300,000 people. So that you begin to see that we just don't have enough people coming to work every day. So we need to be able to manage migration better. And in order to manage migration better in the community, we need a minimum floor, a floor below which no citizen will fall, such that the xenophobia that normally attaches itself to migration will not be an issue. And this is not just for the Caribbean region. This is the point we're making in the ACP meeting in December in Nairobi, that we need to have a global compact that looks at making sure that every citizen of the world can have a minimum level of education and access to health care, such that if they choose to move, they move as a valued asset and not as a burden on other people's populations. Now, I believe that the IDB has a role to play in that. And one of the realities of the Caribbean community is that we have 3 languages, 3? within our Caribbean community, and potentially it could grow. We have Dutch, we have French with Haiti, we have English. And then we are in the middle of a Spanish-speaking world, even in the US. Although I'm not sure that the candidates there realize it.
They could have seen Sunday Super Bowl. That was a good show of
Full Spanish. Full Latino. So that I say these things and I wonder if they're just a little too simple for people to take on. The OAS ought to concentrate itself on a single objective rather than finding itself trying to be all things to all people. If we agreed that over the course of the next decade, the simple, noble objective of trying to get all young people under the age of 18, when they reach the age of 18, to at least be bilingual from Alaska to Chile, we will change the opportunities in this region in a way that we can't even contemplate. And apply it to your own families. All of you who have children want to give your children the best start in life, which invariably means that they're going to get the education and the extracurricular activities and the values and everything. And you do it because you know that once you give them that, there's a great likelihood that they can do for themselves and do better for themselves. Why do we believe that it applies to families but it doesn't apply to populations of countries? The countries, if we can give our citizens the opportunity, one, to be bilingual, and we can give our citizens the opportunity to move, because the biggest threat to migration is xenophobia. And I said last night again that if I could win lotto for this nation, Barbados, what would I do? I would make it possible for every child to travel at least for 8 weeks to whether Suriname, Guyana, Kenya, Ghana, Costa Rica, Brazil, Colombia. Because once people travel for an extended period of time to a different culture, to a place where there's a different religion, their attitude to life changes. And therefore, the kind of negative responses that you may have in the Bahamas to Haitians or in Barbados, as we had years ago, no longer Winston, to ever so welcome, wait for a call, kind of calls, will become a thing of the past. And I say so conscious that the region has more than enough people to meet the needs of Guyana and Suriname. In fact, it doesn't have enough to meet them. But all that we have can help Guyana and Suriname, but are they immediately acceptable in those countries given the xenophobia that attaches itself? Why? Because there's not one, the minimum floor on education and healthcare that allows their citizens to become in as valued assets, and two, there is not the language facility that allows them to move across borders. How can the IDB help? By being strategically focused, almost with blinkers, on promoting education and healthcare in the region, because with that and with language facility, then the countries will do for themselves. And with that, we add now digital literacy as part of the educational process, not just traditional education.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister. I know we could go on, and I know there's a time for a drink and to relax and have an opportunity to share. You're always truly an inspiration to all of us. I know from the IDB you have a lot of food for thought. I will do my part between now and October, and then somebody else will come and take it on from there. But really, it's been an honor and a privilege for all of us to be here with you, and always it's great to have the inspiration and how you challenge our thinking, which is what we really appreciate.
I want to say to you, and I spoke about the bank being a friend in need, but I want to say to you, as you come to the end of 15 years, that you truly have been a friend to our country and to our region. And thank you. In my public career, we have been lucky. President Cardoso and now yourself, both of you have had an acute appreciation for the realities of the Caribbean, and you have been sensitive to the differences that exist in small states. And I don't take it for granted because I've been around long enough to mix with others. And therefore, I want to say to you that as you approach the month of October, know full well that when you're ready to rest, you have a home in Barbados waiting for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and it's clear to me that we gotta make it in the Caribbean. So thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen,